No dog should be out here alone, Marla muttered, brushing the mist from her coat sleeve as she knelt by the frost-bitten grass. Not here. The cemetery was quiet in the way only old places remember how to be. Not with silence, but with a kind of memory. The fog hung low, clinging to the iron fence posts and slinking between the crooked stones like it had secrets to keep. Marla's boots crunched gently across the path as she stepped closer to what had caught her eye, a shape tucked tight against the base of a grave. Unmoving but not lifeless, it was a dog, small, wiry, bone-thin, under a tattered coat of gray and rust. Not young, not old, but weathered like the earth had been trying to claim him for years and he'd just kept saying no. His ribs rose in slow, steady rhythm, and his eyes blinked once, solemn and unafraid. As she approached, she paused. "Hey," she whispered softly, as if louder words might tear the veil of peace around them. "You don't belong here. You're gonna freeze." The dog didn't move, didn't growl, didn't flinch, didn't wag. He simply lifted his head, just enough to let her know he'd heard, then rested it back down on the soil beside the headstone. Marla's breath caught. There was something deliberate in it, the way his body leaned just barely against the stone's base, not in exhaustion, but in reverence. She'd seen plenty of strays in her line of work with the rescue unit, but none had ever curled around a grave like it was a person's lap. She stepped around to the front of the headstone, wiping moss from the inscription with her gloved hand. Her eyes traced the etched letters slowly, each one sinking deeper than the last. Nathaniel Blake, beloved son, age 10. He waited by the gate. He always will. She froze. Her heart knocked once against her ribs like a warning. The dog blinked up at her again, and this time she could see it clearly. The leash, frayed at the end, looped loosely around the side of the stone, not tied, just placed. The wind shifted, lifting Marla's hair across her cheek, and for a moment the whole graveyard seemed to lean in. A faint metallic clink broke the stillness. She looked down. Around the dog's neck, barely visible through the matted fur, hung a dented tag, dulled with time. She squatted closer, reaching slowly, cautiously, brushing back the fur just enough to read the engraving. Leo, Nathaniel's boy. Marla staggered backward, almost slipping on the damp leaves. She stared at the tag, then the grave, then the dog whose eyes never left hers. It didn't make sense. Nathaniel was 10, a child. The grave was dated 12 years ago. 12 years ago. And the dog, he was still here. She knelt again, this time slower, trying to steady her thoughts. "You've been waiting." Since then, her voice cracked, part in disbelief, part in something deeper, a pang in her chest that didn't have a name. Leo didn't answer, but he didn't need to. He shifted slightly, just enough to lean harder into the cold stone as if to say, "This is where I stay. This is still his." Marla's throat tightened. She looked around. No bowls, no bedding, no sign anyone had been feeding him. Just damp earth, wilting flowers long dead, and paw prints sunken into the same patch of mud again and again and again. The twist came not in the story, but in how suddenly it rewrote her. She had come out that morning to check a report about a loose dog on private property. Another routine call in a month of routine calls. But standing here now, amid gravestones older than memory, and a dog who defied time for love, she realized something was unraveling. Or maybe revealing. A quiet scraping sound drew her attention again. Leo had stood up. He wobbled slightly on his paws, but held firm. Then, without warning, he stepped forward and nudged something out from behind the headstone with his snout, a torn scrap of cloth. It was once part of a child's shirt, blue flannel, sun-bleached and brittle. Leo pawed gently, then looked at her. Marla couldn't breathe. That it was an offering, or a reminder. She reached out and touched it, crumbling at the edges like dry leaves. There were tiny teeth marks in one corner, not chewed, but held, carried. Maybe the boy had worn it that day. Maybe it was all Leo had left. Marla blinked hard, the fog burning her eyes now. She stood slowly, hand tightening around her phone. She should call this in. She should contact the shelter, begin paperwork, file a report. That was protocol. But something in her said no, not yet. Not here. Instead, she sat right there in the dirt beside Leo. She said nothing, offered nothing, just sat. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The wind hummed through the trees like breath on glass. Then Leo did something she would remember for the rest of her life. Without sound, without force, he pressed the side of his face into her knee, just once, then curled back around the headstone as if to say, "Thank you, but I'm not leaving, not yet." Marla stared at the engraving one more time, tracing it silently in her mind. He waited by the gate. He always will. She didn't know what kind of gate that was meant to be. Heavens are front porches, yards, maybe all of them. But the dog at the grave didn't need to know where it led. He only knew who he was waiting for, and he still was. Marla didn't sleep that night. She kept seeing Leo's eyes, not pleading, not lost, just still, like someone who had made peace with the impossible and stayed behind anyway. The image of him curled beside that headstone, coat clinging with frost and mud, wouldn't leave her. She kept returning to that inscription. He waited by the gate. He always will. It echoed like a lullaby turned elegy. She didn't understand why it hit so hard. Maybe because it wasn't about a dog, it was about the kind of love that never stopped showing up. By morning, she had made a decision, not the kind that comes from reason but the kind that blooms quietly in the gut before the mind catches up. She would go back. The fog hadn't lifted when she returned to the cemetery. A pale sheet of winter light spilled across the hills, casting the headstones in muted silver. Her boots left damp impressions across the old gravel path, darker where her steps hesitated. She had brought food this time, a fleece blanket, and a thermal jug of warm broth. She didn't know if Leo would accept any of it, but if he was still there, she wasn't going to leave him in the cold again. She spotted the grave from halfway down the slope. The stone stood just as she'd left it, but Leo was gone. Her heart dropped. The food fell from her hands as she rushed. Forward she searched the surrounding plots, the base of the old willow tree, behind the mausoleum wall. Nothing, not even paw prints. She crouched, breath hitching, no signs of struggle, no blood, no fur caught on the fence, and then she saw it. A new imprint in the soil, pressed beside the grave, a pair of small footprints, barefoot, no shoe tread, no adult stride. Just two prints, deep and side by side, like someone had stood there facing Leo, standing still, as if they'd met. She blinked, shaking her head. She wasn't one to fall for ghost stories or illusions drawn in grief. She was practical, methodical, but the prints were there, perfectly shaped, child-sized, too real to ignore. Her breath came in cold plumes. As she reached out and touched the dirt, still warm, she recoiled as if the earth had burned her suddenly. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was watching. A rustle in the tree canopy made her jolt, but it was only a crow lifting off into the pale sky. She exhaled slowly, heart thudding in a wild, uneven rhythm. If someone had taken Leo, there would be tracks. If he had wandered off, he would have left a trail. But there was only stillness. And those two prints. Marla stood there for a long time, unsure whether to feel grief or. Then, just as she turned to leave, a sharp whistle sliced through the quiet, not mechanical, not from any bird. It was high, short, and unmistakably human, like a child calling a dog home. She froze mid-step. No other sound followed, just the trees shifting gently in the breeze and a soft chime from somewhere deeper in the cemetery, like a bell on a collar moving with wind, or something else entirely. Later that afternoon, she returned to the rescue center. She didn't speak to anyone at first, just sat in her office, staring at the grain in her desk until her hand stopped shaking. Then she opened the archives. Leo's tag had said Nathaniel's boy. There had to be something, a report, an incident, a record. It took 3 hours to find. The file was faded, handwritten, from over a decade ago. A call logged by a distraught mother reporting her son missing near Oak Ridge Cemetery. 10-year-old Nathaniel Blake, last seen walking home with the family's dog, Leo, after school. Witnesses claimed the boy had taken the back trail near the cemetery's boundary. Heavy rains that week had flooded the lower trail, and he never came home. The dog had returned 3 days later, soaked, bleeding, alone. They found the backpack snagged in the river reeds. They never found the body. Marla leaned back in her chair, every breath sharp in her lungs. That meant the grave she'd seen wasn't over a burial. It was a cenotaph, a marker, a place to mourn what had never been found, a promise stone. Her fingers trembled as she scanned the rest of the page. One note stood out, scribbled in the margin in faded red ink. Dog refused to leave the grave. Family let him stay. Died 3 winters later, but the line trailed off. Marla stared at it. Died 3 winters later, but Leo was there, alive, lean, yes, weathered, but breathing. Unless she pushed away from the desk, pulse pounding in her ears. Either someone was playing a cruel, impossible trick, or the dog she had touched, spoken to, sat beside, was something else entirely. A memory made flesh, a grief that refused to die. And then her phone vibrated. It was the groundskeeper from Oak Ridge. She answered. I don't mean to alarm you, his voice crackled through, but there's something you should know. That dog, the one you saw by the grave, he's back. Marla stood. What do you mean back? He wasn't there this morning, I swear, but just now I saw him. Same spot, same way, curled up, like nothing ever happened. Marla didn't respond. Ms. Fenner, the man repeated, uncertain, but she was already grabbing her coat, because now she needed to know who or what Leo truly was, and why, after all this time, he had returned. The clouds had begun to break by late afternoon, casting fractured sunlight across the cemetery as Marla stood at the edge of the grave. Leo hadn't moved since she'd arrived hours earlier, still curled beside Nathaniel Blake's headstone, guarding it like a sentinel carved from grief. She had called in to postpone the rest of her route. No one argued. Something in her voice must have said don't ask. She had brought water, some food, a wool blanket from the back of the truck. He accepted none of it. Only when she placed the blanket over the grass near the stone did he shift once to touch it with his nose, then return to his post. It was clear now this wasn't just a place he wandered to. This was home. As dusk approached, a figure arrived at the gate. An old man, thin and stooped, wearing a pressed brown coat and moving like every step cost him a memory. He didn't glance at the other graves. His eyes locked immediately onto the dog, then the headstone, then Marla. Something in his expression faltered as he reached the fence, like he'd braced himself for this moment, and still it broke through. "Heard he was still here," he said quietly. Marla stepped closer, not sure if the man was speaking to her or to the boy he once knew. "You knew Nathaniel?" He nodded slowly. "I taught him 4th grade. He smiled, though it barely held. He used to draw dogs in the margins of his spelling homework, always the same one. Big ears, skinny frame. Called him Leo before he ever had a real dog." Marla felt a cold shift run through her. "Wait, you're saying this dog came after Nathaniel passed?" The man's silence was answer enough. He stepped through the open gate, his shoes crunching softly through the fallen leaves as he approached. 6 months after the accident, a stray showed up outside the boy's old house. Wouldn't leave the porch. The family was gone by then. Moved out west, but the neighbors, they tried to feed him, chase him off, even call the pound. He'd disappeared during the day, but always came back at night. Marla's voice barely made it past her throat. "He found the grave. No one brought him here," the man replied. "That's the strange part." Leo lifted his head, just slightly, acknowledging the old man with a slow blink before settling back down. Marla knelt again, eyes heavy. "He's waited all these years. For someone who never knew him." The man shook his head gently. "Maybe he did know him, just not the way we understand." They both stood in silence as the wind stirred around them. The cemetery stretched on like a sea of unspoken names, but only this one, this boy, had a dog who came for him long after the rest of the world forgot. Marla glanced toward her truck in the distance, where her phone buzzed unanswered. She had meant to call someone animal control, maybe a rescue coordinator, but every time she reached for the phone, something stopped her. Leo wasn't a stray. He was on duty. Then, a sound neither of them expected. Leo growled. Low, steady, not aggressive but alert. They turned. A second vehicle had pulled up beside Marla's truck, quiet as the wind. A woman stepped out, cautious, shoulders tense. She carried a leather folder hugged tightly to her chest, and wore grief like a weight she'd never put down. Her gaze swept the headstones until she saw the Marla, the old man, the dog, and the grave. Her steps quickened. "I got the letter," she said breathlessly. "From the groundskeeper. Said a dog wouldn't leave my brother's grave." Marla froze. "You're Nathaniel's sister?" "Claire," the woman said, nodding. "I was 15 when he died. I never came back." "Couldn't." Leo didn't growl now. He rose slowly and walked to her, less like a pet greeting an owner and more like a soldier reporting in. Claire looked down, stunned. He sniffed her hand, circled her once, and sat, not beside the grave this time, but beside her. Her knees gave out and she sank to the ground, tears already falling. "He drew you," she whispered. "All those drawings I thought were imaginary. You're real." The folder in her arms slipped open, scattering papers and sketches onto the grass. Marla caught a glimpse of childlike pencil sketches of a dog, beside a tree, beside a fence, beside a gravestone. One had words scribbled in big, uneven letters. "Leo waits for me. I won't be scared if he's there." The cold wrapped around them all, but none of them moved. Not even the wind dared interrupt. For the first time in years, Leo let himself rest fully, not at the headstone, but beside Claire. As if he knew. As if he had waited long enough, and now something was changing. The morning after Marla returned before sunrise, fog still clung to the headstones like breath that hadn't left the earth. She carried a thermos of broth, a worn fleece blanket, and something she hadn't carried in years, a weight in her chest she couldn't name, but one she recognized all the same. Leo was still there, still pressed against Nathaniel's grave, as though the night had passed without him knowing. But his body had shifted, curled tighter, breathing shallow, one paw twitching from cold or memory. When Marla crouched beside him, he didn't lift his head. "I brought something warm," she said softly, pouring the broth into a small bowl and placing it within reach. He didn't react, not even a glance. She touched the fleece to his side and felt the chill in his ribs. It wasn't just exposure. It was endurance reaching its edge. She sat with him again, this time placing the blanket not on him but around both of them, as if she could lend him part of her warmth. For a long while they remained like that, a woman, a dog, and a headstone no one had visited in years. But then a voice broke the stillness. "You shouldn't be here." It came from behind, firm, not unkind. Marla turned. A man in his 50s stood at the cemetery gate, keys in one hand, a satchel slung over his shoulder. "Groundskeeper." His name tag read T. Nolan. She stood slowly. "I'm with animal welfare. Got a report yesterday. Found him curled here." Nolan nodded grimly. "He's been here longer than you'd believe." Marla hesitated. "How long exactly?" "First saw him 8 winters back. Always comes and goes. Leaves just before the snow breaks, then comes back again in spring. Never lets me near. Sleeps here, always here." "But the boy," Marla glanced at the grave. "He died 12 years ago." The man stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. "Dog first showed up a few weeks after the funeral. People thought he belonged to someone else, wandered into the wrong place, but year after year, same grave, same dog." His voice dropped. "Someone used to leave biscuits. At the fence, little ones. I stopped seeing those around the 3rd year. A chill ran through her. You mean someone else was feeding him? I think the family did. For a while. Until they stopped coming. There was something in Nolan's tone that made her pause. Not bitterness, but resignation. Like he'd long stopped trying to understand it and simply learned to live beside it. He's dying, Marla said quietly. I know, Nolan replied, without turning. And I think he knows too. She looked back at Leo. His breathing had grown even lighter. His eyes closed now, but he wasn't asleep. He was still listening, still aware, still waiting. Something twisted in her gut, not pity, but awe. There was a truth in this dog's vigil. Something ancient and impossible to explain in words, and it was unraveling the center of her. Then she remembered something, from the tag Nathaniel's boy. Nolan, she said slowly, you've worked here a long time. Do you know what happened to the Blake family? He nodded. Moved to Ohio. After the accident, nothing held them here. The father couldn't drive past the park anymore. Mother was just ... gone. Not physically, but she never really came back from it. The accident. Hit and run. Nathaniel was walking home from school. They say he always waited at the corner for the crossing guard, even when she was late. But that day, he didn't. Or maybe she never came. No one really knows. Marla swallowed. Was Leo there? Some say yes. Some say the dog chased the car after it happened. Others say he stayed beside the boy until paramedics came. Rumors. But Leo remembers. Nolan's gaze softened. I think he does. They stood in silence as a breeze stirred the grass, lifting dead leaves in small swirls. Marla could feel something shifting, the story pulling toward a reckoning. Then Leo moved. Barely a single paw dragged forward through the dirt, pressing faintly into the soil as if reaching. His head turned slightly toward the grave, and a soft whimper escaped him, not pain, not fear, a call or a goodbye. Marla knelt fast, touching his shoulder. His eyes opened briefly, locking with hers. In them, she saw not desperation but peace. A readiness he had held on long enough for something. For someone. And now he was letting go, but just before his eyes closed again, his head dipped, not into a hand, but into the fold of the flannel scrap he had carried. The last piece of Nathaniel. Then he was still, completely still. Marla didn't move. Her fingers trembled slightly on his fur. The blanket still wrapped around both of them, as if holding the story together a moment longer, and in that silence, Nolan whispered something she would never forget. That dog didn't guard a grave, he guarded a promise. A crow called from the fence, somewhere beyond the stones. The frost was beginning to lift, but Marla stayed kneeling because in that moment, she understood something deep and aching. This wasn't just loyalty, it was love, the kind that never asked for anything in return, the kind that waits, through wind and season and silence, without ever believing it's over. And even in the face of death, Leo had never walked away. The cemetery never truly went quiet after that day, even in the hush of morning or the hush, deeper than dusk. Something remained, not noise, but presence. Marla returned once more, a week after Leo's final breath, walking the gravel path with the same deliberate steps, though now it felt more like visiting someone known than investigating something strange. The headstone had not changed, nor the flannel scrap, now carefully folded and sealed in a clear frame beside the grave, but someone had added something new, a small flat stone with a single word carved into it. Faithful. Marla had asked Nolan who placed it there. He only shrugged, and said maybe it just belonged. But she had a feeling. Quiet gestures didn't need signatures. Leo's story had begun as a whisper between trees, but it had stirred something larger. Visitors now came few, not many, some with children, some alone, not to gawk but to sit, to leave behind treats or handwritten notes, folded tight, and tucked beside the grave like offerings. One read simply, I believe now. Marla sat cross-legged in the grass and let her hand rest near the place where Leo had last curled. The earth was firmer now, the shape of him, gone, but not lost. She didn't know what came next for the boy, for the dog, for those they unknowingly touched. But she understood this. Some bonds stretched beyond the logic of years, beyond the blunt edge of grief or the rules of how things should end. Leo never needed rescue. He needed to finish what he started. As clouds passed overhead, a shaft of light broke through and fell gently on the grave, illuminating both names, boy and dog, etched and unetched side by side in a silence that no longer felt empty. And in that stillness, Marla smiled. Not because it was over, but because some stories never really are.